The wheels of the stagecoach had stopped turning, but the rattle lived on inside Clara's bones. For 3 weeks, it had been her only constant, a grinding rhythm that shook her teeth and settled deep in her marrow. Now, there was only silence, made heavier by a wind that had no trees to stop it. It just tore across the high plains, slicing through the thin wool of her coat as if it were muslin. She stepped down onto the frozen mud of the street, her legs trembling. Her small valise, covered in alkali dust, felt heavier than it had any right to be. It held one other dress, a brush, and the letter. This was Dry Creek. It was not a town. It was a wound in the earth, a collection of gray, unpainted buildings huddled against the vast, empty sky. The street was a river of ankle-deep mud, frozen in ruts. Across the way, a 2-story building called itself a hotel, but its windows were dark. Beside her, the saloon breathed out a stale warmth that smelled of whiskey and unwashed men. Clara pulled her coat tighter. It was a city coat, meant for a brisk autumn walk, not for a winter at the top of the world. She was exhausted, a deep, weary ache that had passed beyond hunger or thirst. She was just empty. She had been passed from her father's house to a train, from the train to this rattling coach, all on the promise of a man she had never met, a Mr. Jedediah Brown, who had written of a prosperous hardware business and the need for a good wife. She checked the letter again, her fingers stiff and blue. The paper was worn to softness at the creases. Arrive October 20th. I will meet your coach at the saloon. I am a plain man, but fair. It was October 20th. This was the saloon. She was here. She stood by the horse trough, trying to look respectable, trying not to shiver so hard her teeth clicked. The stage driver, a man who had not spoken more than 5 words to her the entire journey, tossed her valise into the mud near her feet. End of the line, he grunted, and disappeared into the saloon without a backward glance. Clara waited. The wind was relentless. It stung her eyes until they watered, and the tears froze on her cheeks. She felt the stairs first, a woman in a faded calico dress, her face weathered like old leather, came out of the general store. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the thin coat, the cheap hat, and the hopeful, terrified posture. The woman's mouth twisted. She spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the mud, missing Clara's boots by an inch. "You poor fool," the woman muttered, loud enough for Clara to hear. Then she, too, was gone, vanishing back into the shadows of the store. Clara's stomach tightened into a cold knot. Fool? The saloon doors swung open again, spilling yellow light and a roar of male laughter. This time, men came out. 3 of them, broad-shouldered in heavy sheepskin coats. They were not looking for a driver. They were looking right at her. One, a burly man with a red beard, pointed. "Well, it's her. She actually came." Another man, younger and leaner, slapped his thigh. "Look at it. Silas. Scrawnier than that coyote we shot last week. And look at that coat. Think she expects a ball?" The red-bearded man, Silas, stepped closer. He was chewing on a piece of straw, his eyes raking over her with a cold amusement. "That you, miss?" he drawled, his voice loud for the whole street to hear. "You the mail-order bride come for Jedediah Brown?" Clara could barely find her voice. "Yes, I am Clara. Is he here?" The men exploded. It was not a chuckle. It was a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the false front buildings. Silas took the straw from his mouth and tossed it. "Oh, he's here," he roared, gesturing back at the saloon. "He's in there, on the floor, drunk as a skunk for the 3rd day running. He don't own a hardware store. Miss, he don't own anything but the clothes on his back and a thirst that drain a river." Clara's hand went to her throat. The letter, the promise. "But the advertisement. He wrote." "We wrote," the younger man corrected her, grinning. "It was a joke. See, old Sam, the bartender, Bet us $10 we couldn't get some desperate spinster to actually show up for worthless Jed. Looks like I win. Boys? The world tilted. The laughter was a physical thing, pushing against her. A joke. The weeks of travel. The last of her father's money spent on the ticket. The tiny, frail sprout of hope she had guarded in her chest. All of it was a joke. They were laughing at her desperation, at her thin coat and her worn-out boots. She was not a bride. She was the punchline. Clara stood frozen. Humiliation was a living thing, a hot, acrid poison that filled her mouth and burned behind her eyes. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She just stood there, staring at the saloon door, as the reality settled over her like a shroud. No one was coming. There was no Mr. Brown. There was no new life. There was only the mud, the wind, and the laughter of cruel men. Across the street, half hidden in the deep shadow between the livery and the smithy, Luke had seen it all. He had watched the stage arrive, a daily ritual that broke the monotony. He had seen the woman step out, small and unprepared, looking like a bird blown miles off course. He had seen her stand and wait, her shoulders tightening against the cold. He knew that kind of cold. It had lived in his own house for 3 years. He watched the ranchers emerge, already loud with drink. He knew Silas and the younger one, Caleb. They were careless men who found sport in the weakness of others. He heard their laughter, sharp and ugly in the fading light. He saw the woman flinch, saw her spine straighten, a last defiant act of dignity. Luke's first instinct was to stay hidden. Trouble was not his business. His business was his cattle, his land, and the ghost that waited for him back at his cabin. He had nothing to offer anyone, least of all a woman who had been so thoroughly broken in the space of 5 minutes. Then he saw her hands, shoved deep into the pockets of her flimsy coat. They were raw and red. He remembered another pair of hands, small and capable, kneading dough, braiding his hair, hands he had failed to save. He did not think about it. He moved. He stepped out of the shadows, and his long-legged stride carried him across the street in seconds. He was a tall man, made taller by the shadows, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He moved with a quiet purpose that made the ranchers pause their laughter. Clara heard the boot steps in the mud, solid and heavy. She tensed, expecting another tormentor. A tall figure stopped in front of her, blocking the wind and the sight of the laughing men. Luke did not look at the ranchers. He did not look Clara in the eye. He simply undid the buttons of his own coat, a heavy, worn sheepskin coat, dark with use and smelling of wood smoke and pine. He shrugged it off his broad shoulders and, in one smooth motion, settled it around hers. The warmth was immediate. The weight was a shock. It was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, the sleeves hanging past her fingers. It was the first true warmth she had felt in weeks. The ranchers quieted, confused. Luke was not a man to be crossed. He was quiet, but there was a stillness to him that decent men respected and fools learned to fear. "That's enough. Silas." Luke's voice was low, rough from disuse, like gravel rolling over dry leaves. Silas scoffed, but the humor was gone. "Now, Luke, this ain't your affair. We was just having some fun." "Your fun is over." Luke's gaze was flat and cold. He turned his attention to Clara, though he still seemed to be looking at a point just past her shoulder. "You got a place to stay, miss?" Clara could not speak. She could only shake her head, the wool of the coat scratching her chin. Luke nodded, as if he expected it. He bent down and picked up her valise from the mud, his large, gloved hand wrapping around the handle. "You can stay at my homestead, just for the night, until you figure things out." He did not offer it as a question. It was a statement. He turned and started walking toward a horse hitched outside the general store, not waiting to see if she would follow. Clara looked back at the saloon. The men were still there, watching, their smiles gone. replaced by sullen curiosity. She looked at the dark windows of the hotel. She looked at the endless, frozen street. She had no money. She had no one. She pulled the heavy coat tighter and followed the silent man. His horse was a big roan, steady and strong. He tossed her valise into a saddlebag and then, with an impersonal efficiency, put his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle. She was so light he barely grunted. He swung up behind her, settling into the saddle with familiar ease. Clara sat stiffly, her back rigid, careful not to lean against the solid wall of his chest. His body heat radiated through his shirt, a strange, unwelcome intimacy. She could smell the coat that surrounded her, leather, sweat, horse, and that faint, clean scent of wood smoke. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved, its hooves making a soft sucking sound as they pulled from the mud. They left the small cluster of buildings behind, heading out into a vast, open field dusted with an early, clinging snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the plodding of the horse and the squeak of the leather tack. The sun was a smear of bloody orange on the horizon, and the air grew sharper. Biting at the small patches of her face the coat did not cover. She was too humiliated to cry. The shame had burned past tears and left only a cold, brittle numbness. She had been sold by her family, shipped like freight, and discarded as a joke. Now she was riding into the wilderness with a stranger who had not even told her his name. She was a fool, just as the woman had said. Luke said nothing. He rode with an easy familiarity, one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on his thigh. He seemed part of the dusk, as solid and silent as the dark hills rising in the distance. He was aware of the small, shivering woman in his saddle, of the tension in her spine. He kept his distance, offering her the space of his silence. It was the only other thing he had to give. It felt like an hour, or perhaps a lifetime, before a small shape grew out of the darkness. A cabin, set against a low hill, with a small barn and a corral. A thread of smoke rose from the chimney, pale against the darkening purple sky. He dismounted, then reached up for her. "Ma'am!" She slid down, her legs buckling slightly when she hit the ground. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then let go as if he had been burned. He grabbed her valise and led the way to the door. He pushed it open. The cabin was one room, and it was lonely. But it was clean. A fire was banked in the hearth, casting a low, orange glow. A simple cot was pushed against one wall. A table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and a few shelves held tins and plates. It was the sparest room she had ever seen, a place built for function, not for comfort. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it. Beside the stone hearth, one of the main support beams was not an even, rough-hewn brown. It was black, a deep, scarred charcoal. The grain of the wood twisted and bubbled from an intense heat. The fire had been put out, but the scar remained, a permanent scream in the quiet room. Clara looked from the beam to the man. He was at the stove, adding wood to the firebox, his back to her. She suddenly understood the emptiness in his eyes, the deep quiet that surrounded him. This was not just a lonely place. It was a place of deep, unspoken sorrow. "The bed is yours," he said, his voice still low. He did not turn around. "I'll take the floor. There's stew in the pot. You should eat." He moved to the corner, took 2 thick blankets from a trunk, and spread them on the floor near the hearth, as far from the bed as he could get. He sat down, his back against the wall, and began to pull off his boots. Clara did not move. She did not eat. She was too full of shame, too empty of hope. She sat on the edge of the cot, still wrapped in his massive coat. The cabin was warm, but she could not stop shivering. Darkness fell completely. The only light was the pulse of the fire in the hearth, painting shadows on the walls. The man, Luke, lay on the floor, turned away from her, a dark shape under the blankets. For a long time, The only sound was the wind whining around the corners of the cabin and the pop and settle of the fire. Clara thought he was asleep. Then she heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was a hitch in his breathing, a small, choked sound, quickly stifled. It came again and again, the quiet, desperate sound of a man crying in the dark, trying so hard not to be heard that his whole body shook with the effort. He was crying for the ghost in the charred beam. Clara lay down on the cot, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She lay on her back, staring at the dark ceiling, and pretended she was deaf. She pretended she did not hear the sound of a grief so profound it vibrated in the very air of the room. It was an intrusion, a private pain she had no right to witness. The silence returned, heavier this time. She lay awake. The man's coat still pooled around her. The hours passed. The fire burned low. She could not hold it in. It was not a sob, but a whisper, pushed out of her by the crushing weight of the day. She spoke it to the darkness, to the scarred beam, to the crying man. "Don't laugh," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I was sent here as a joke." The shape on the floor went utterly still. He did not move. He did not answer. The silence stretched, and Clara felt a new, hot shame. She had spoken the unspeakable. She had given voice to her humiliation and burdened him with it. She closed her eyes, praying for a sleep that would not come. She must have drifted off, exhausted past the point of awareness. Hours later, in the deep cold before the dawn, she was half roused by a slight weight. He was standing over her cot, a shadow against the dying embers. He had taken one of his own blankets from the floor and was gently, carefully, placing it over her. He tucked it around her shoulders, his movements slow, his touch feather-light, barely grazing the quilt. Luke said nothing. He just added the blanket, an answer in the dark. Then he returned to his cold spot on the floor, leaving her wrapped in an extra layer of warmth. The first night bled into a week. The words, "just for the night," hung in the air, unspoken, becoming a quiet lie they both agreed to. The winter deepened, sealing them in. The wind howled a constant, thin scream around the cabin's eaves, and the snow piled in drifts that buried the bottom of the single window. Dry Creek was a distant thought, a bruise on the horizon, but it was there. After 10 days, their supplies ran low. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee tin held only dust. Luke pulled on his heavy coat, the one he had taken back from Clara the first morning, leaving her his older, lighter jacket, which was still far too large. "Stay inside. Keep the fire fed," he said. It was not a request. Clara watched him from the window, a small, dark figure shrinking against the vast, blinding white of the snow. She was alone in the cabin for hours, surrounded by the quiet hum of his life, the clean floor, the neatly stacked firewood, the worn handle of his razor on a shelf, and the charred beam. Always the charred beam. It was a silent witness, a tombstone in the center of the home. She felt like a ghost herself, haunting the edges of his grief. She swept the floor, scrubbed the pot, and waited. The silence was a heavy blanket she could not throw off. When he returned, the hoarse blowing clouds of steam, she ran to the door, a knot of fear in her stomach she hadn't known was there. She was terrified he would not come back. He said nothing as he unloaded the sacks of flour and beans, but as he hung his coat, a small parcel fell from the pocket. He nudged it with his boot, a flush creeping up his neck. "What is it?" she asked. "Storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Abernathy. She sent it. For you." Clara unwrapped the brown paper. Inside were 2 lengths of sturdy, gray wool flannel, thick and warm, and a small bag of sewing needles and thread. It was not a gift of welcome. It was a gift of necessity. A clear message that the town knew she was still here, and that she was improperly dressed. The charity stung, but the warmth of the fabric was undeniable. I have no money to pay, she began. It's paid, Luke said, already turning away to check the horse's hoof. The conversation was over. That night, she sat by the fire, cutting the flannel with his skinning knife, her stitches small and clumsy, trying to fashion a dress that would fit. The next week, the snow let up, and the cold was a sharp, clear ache. Luke took her to the barn. You're staying, he said, again, not a question. You can't be useless. His words were hard, but his voice was not unkind. It was practical. Survival was a harsh equation, and he was adding her to it. He taught her how to split wood, wincing as she awkwardly swung the axe, her small frame struggling with the weight. He showed her how to line the north wall of the barn with straw bales to keep the horses from freezing. He taught her how to mend the fence line near the cabin. His large, gloved hands moved with a practiced economy, stretching the cold wire, twisting it tight. Her own fingers, raw and blue, fumbled with the metal. No, he said, his voice gruff. He took her hands, his bare palms rough against her skin, and physically moved her fingers, showing her how to use her weight to gain leverage. Like this. Don't fight it. Use the cold. It makes the wire brittle. You just have to know where to push. She learned to feed the animals, the way the horses would nuzzle her pocket looking for the apple core he had told her to save. She learned the rhythms of his homestead. He was a man who wasted nothing, not a piece of wood, not a scrap of food, and certainly not a word. They lived in the small cabin like two shadows, orbiting the same dim light. They ate their meals of beans and salted pork in silence. They worked until their muscles ached and they fell into their separate beds. She on the cot, he on the cold floor, too tired for anything but the black void of sleep. One night, the wind was particularly brutal. It found every crack in the cabin, sending icy fingers of air across the floor. Clara watched Luke from her cot. He was shivering in his blankets, his body curled tight, but he made no sound. She had been there for a month. She had eaten his food, slept in his bed, and worn his dead wife's cast-off clothes, which she'd found in a trunk and he'd pretended not to notice. I don't understand you, she whispered into the darkness. He went still. There's nothing to understand. Why did you do it? Why did you bring me here? He was silent for a long time. The cold, he said finally, his voice muffled by the blanket. I know what that kind of cold feels like. No one should feel it alone. His answer loosened something in her, a knot of shame she had been carrying since the day she arrived. She sat up, pulling her own quilt around her shoulders. They were right to laugh, she said, her voice flat. I am a fool. I was baggage, unwanted. Luke turned over, his face a pale shape in the moonlight from the window. He was listening. My sister, Eleanor, she's very beautiful. She married a banker from Philadelphia, a very rich man. My father, he was so proud. I was just the other one, the plain one, too quiet, too tall. No one knew what to do with me. She stared at the fire, at the red embers. When my mother died, there was no place for me. My father gave me $50 and told me about the correspondence brides. He said it was my best chance. He said he was selling me, but at least he was honest about it. He just wanted me gone, so he could move in with Eleanor and her rich husband. I was the last piece of furniture he had to get rid of. She finally looked at him. So when those men, when they said I was a joke, they were just saying what my own father already knew. I'm not worth anything. Luke sat up slowly. The firelight caught the planes of his face, the deep shadows under his eyes. He looked at the charred beam, his gaze fixed on it as if it were a person. Worth, he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Worth is a word men use when they want to buy or sell something. It's got nothing to do with people. He reached out and laid a piece of kindling on the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Her name was Sarah. Clara's breath caught. He had never spoken of it. She wasn't like you, he said, his voice rough. She was small, and she was loud, laughed all the time, filled this place with noise. She grew flowers in that window box, even when they died in the frost. She just planted more. He stared at the flames, but he was seeing something else. We'd been married a year. I was checking the line camps up north. A 3-day ride, I was gone. A group of men, bandits, scavengers. They came through. They weren't from here. They were just passing, looking for trouble. They found it. His hands curled into fists on his knees. They took what little we had, some whiskey, a side of bacon, and then, for sport, they locked the door from the outside. Clara put a hand over her mouth, a silent, sick understanding dawning. They torched it, the whole cabin. They must have been long gone by the time the flames took hold. I was still a day's ride out when I saw the smoke. I thought it was a grass fire. I rode the horse until its lungs bled. He stopped. The silence in the cabin was terrible, filled with the sound of a woman screaming, a sound only he could hear. By the time I got here, he whispered, it was just this. The fire was still burning. The door was still locked. I was too far away. I was too late. He looked at his hands. I saved the beam. I don't know why. I rebuilt the rest of the cabin, but I left that to remember, I don't know. Clara's own humiliation felt small and thin compared to his raw, gaping wound. He had lost a life. She had only lost her pride. She said nothing. There were no words for a thing like that. She just watched him, this quiet, broken man who had wrapped her in his coat when she had nothing. The next morning, Clara woke with a new, cold purpose. While Luke was in the barn, she took his tools from the shed. She found a heavy wood scraper and a block of sandstone. She went to the charred beam. She pressed the metal edge against the blackened wood and scraped. A flurry of black dust and charcoal fell to the floor. Underneath, the wood was still dark, but it was wood. She scraped again, her arm aching with the effort. When Luke came back inside, he stopped dead, watching her. She didn't look at him. She just kept working, the shh of the scraper, the only sound. He walked past her, poured a cup of coffee, and stood by the window, his back to her. He watched her fight the wood for nearly an hour. The pile of black dust at her feet grew. Her breathing was ragged, her face smudged with soot. Finally, he set his cup down. He took the scraper from her hand. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice gentle. "You have to go with the grain, or you'll scar what's left underneath." He placed his hand over hers on the handle and guided her. "See, long strokes. Let the tool do the work." He let go. She continued. And then he picked up the block of sandstone and began to sand the section she had already scraped. His movement steady and sure. They worked all day. They did not speak. They just worked, side by side. Scrape, sand, scrape, sand. The smell of old fire and new, raw pine filled the cabin. They uncovered the wood, inch by painful inch. It was not perfect. It was still dark, stained with smoke and memory. But it was smooth. It was clean. It was no longer a thing of horror. It was just wood. That night, they were both covered in fine black dust, exhausted in a way that felt clean. The cold snap did not break. That night, the temperature plummeted. The water in the bucket by the door froze solid. Clara lay in the cot, shivering so violently she could not sleep, her teeth chattering. On the floor, Luke was in a similar state, the cold surviving up through the floorboards. Around midnight, he got up, his movements stiff. He added 2 more logs to the fire, but it was not enough. The wind was too strong. He stood over her cot, a dark shadow. "You're going to be sick," he said. I can't get warm." He looked at his bed on the floor, then at the cot. The cot was narrow, built for one, but it was farther from the drafty door. "Move over," he said. Clara's heart hammered. "What?" "Move over. We'll freeze to death like this. It's just for warmth." She scrambled to the side, pressing her back against the cold wall. He hesitated, then laid his blankets on top of hers and slid under, his back to her. The cot was small. They were pressed together, back to back. His warmth a solid, startling presence. Clara lay rigid, her eyes wide open in the dark, barely breathing. She was acutely aware of every place his body touched hers, shoulders, back, legs. He was just as tense. They lay like two planks of wood. Strangers forced into an intimacy neither of them had asked for. But he was warm. His body heat was a furnace, slowly, agonizingly. The deep, shaking chill in her bones began to recede. Her shivering quieted. His breathing deepened. They lay like that for hours. Just before dawn, she drifted into a half-sleep. She must have turned, because when she woke, she was facing him. Her hand, trapped between their bodies, was resting on his chest. His arm was draped over her waist, his own hand resting near hers. Their fingers brushed. A jolt went through her, sharp as lightning. He woke at the same instant, his fingers tensed against hers. Neither of them moved. They just lay there, breathing in the same small space, their fingers touching. It was not desire, it was connection, a simple human touch in the dark. His fingers lingered, brushing hers again. A question. She did not pull away. He let out a slow breath and gently, carefully, moved his arm, disentangling himself. He sat up, the cold air rushing into the space between them. "The fire," he muttered, and fled the bed. The next time he went to town, he came back with the usual supplies. But he was different. He seemed agitated, avoiding her gaze more than usual. That evening, she found it, sitting on the hearth. On the newly cleaned spot where the beam met the stone was a small packet wrapped in brown paper. "Luke?" He was at the basin, washing his face, pretending not to hear. She opened it. Inside, coiled like a sleeping snake, was a ribbon. It was not a plain ribbon. It was a deep, shocking, beautiful blue, the color of a mountain lake, made of smooth, shining silk. She stared at it. It was the most frivolous, beautiful thing she had ever touched. It's blue," she whispered, stating the obvious. He dried his face on the towel, his back to her. "Your hair," he said, his voice thick. "It's the color of, well, it deserves something nice." He still did not turn around. Clara's eyes flooded with tears. She had not cried when she was humiliated. She had not cried when she was cold, but a simple blue ribbon broke her. She tied it in her hair, her fingers trembling. The silk was cool and smooth. It was a splash of life. Later, while he was in the barn, she looked at her reflection in the dark. Still water of the washing-up bucket. She saw a gaunt, tired face, but she also saw a bright blue ribbon. A small, hesitant smile touched the corner of her mouth. It felt strange, like a muscle she had not used in years. The town did not miss the change. A smile, a ribbon, a man and a woman living under one roof. The gossip, which had been a low murmur, turned sharp. Luke had to go to the saloon. Not for whiskey, he never touched it, but to settle a bill with the smithy, who was always there after dark. Clara waited. She paced the cabin. The work on the beam was done. The cabin felt warmer, but the world outside felt colder. He was gone for a long time. When the door finally opened, he stumbled in, and the smell of whiskey and blood hit her first. "Luke." He raised a hand to stop her. He was not drunk, but he was hurt. His knuckles were split and bleeding, his left eye already swelling. He went straight to the basin and plunged his raw hand into the icy water, hissing through his teeth. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who did this?" He scrubbed the blood from his skin, the water turning a pale, rusty pink. He dried his hand, his face set in hard lines. He turned to face her. The single, flickering lamp cast deep shadows across his bruised face. "Silas," he said, "the rancher, the man who had laughed the loudest. Him and Caleb. They were waiting." "What did they say?" she whispered, though she already knew. Luke looked at her, at the blue ribbon in her hair, at the fear in her eyes. His own gaze was dark. The ice in them melted and replaced by a low, burning fire. "They called you a joke," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They called you leftovers." He took a step closer to her, his shadow falling over her. He slowly raised his one good hand, the one that was not bleeding, and touched the blue ribbon in her hair, his rough fingers clumsy against the silk. "You're not a joke." The snow did not melt. It rotted. It sank into the ground under a weak spring sun, turning the world into a vast, sucking ocean of mud. The wind lost its razor edge, but it carried a new, damp chill that settled deep in the bones. The sound of dripping water was constant, a slow, maddening drumbeat signaling the earth's uneasy thaw. With the thaw, their small world expanded. The cabin, which had been a fortress against the winter, now felt small, cramped. The air was thick with the smell of smoked meat, damp wool, and the two of them, living in each other's space, breathing the same air. Luke's fight in the saloon had changed things. It had drawn a line in the mud, and they were on one side of it, together. The town was on the other. He had returned with bruised knuckles and a swollen eye, but he had returned to her. He had defended her. He had called her his, not in words, but with his fist. The shared bed was no longer just for warmth. It was a silent acknowledgement. They lay side by side, his back to her back to him, a careful, respectful distance between them. But the distance was a lie. Clara was aware of every breath he took, of the way he tensed when she shifted, of the solid, living warmth that radiated from him. He was a good man, he was a kind man, but he was a man locked in a prison. He began to ride the property lines every day, checking the damage from the winter. Clara, now dressed in the clothes she had sewn from the gray flannel, worked beside him. She was stronger. The cold and the work had put a wiry resilience in her thin frame. She could mend a fence almost as well as he could, her smaller fingers nimble with the cold wire. He treated her with a deep, almost painful, respect. He spoke to her, his voice low. He pointed out a hawk circling, the first green shoots of crocus pushing through the muck near the cabin's foundation. He trusted her with the horses. He ate the bread she baked, a dense, heavy loaf, and said, "It's good." But he did not touch her. He would hand her a tool, and his fingers would pull back as if the metal were hot. He would pass her in the narrow space between the table and the stove, and he would press himself flat against the wall, careful that not even his sleeve brushed her arm. At night, he lay so still in the bed that he might have been carved from the same wood as the cot. Clara felt it as a constant, dull ache. He had wrapped her in his coat. He had bled for her. He had shared his home and his grief with her. But he held himself apart, a ghost in his own house. And he was making her a ghost, too. She was the woman he lived with, but not the woman he wanted. The shame she had felt in Dry Creek returned, changed. She was no longer a joke. She was a duty, a burden he had taken on and was now too decent to set down. The tension drew a new, sharp line between them. Then the outside world pressed in. Luke found the first cut fence in the south pasture. It was not a break from snow or a weak wire. It was cut clean, the metal snipped with tools. 3 of his best heifers had wandered, lost in the hills. "Was it an accident?" Clara asked, watching him coil the ruined wire, his jaw tight. "No," he said, just that one word. He spent the next 2 days riding, finally finding the animals, but one had a broken leg and he had to put it down. He did the work, his face a mask of cold fury. A week later, it was the water. He came back from the small creek that fed his main trough, his face gray. He was carrying a bucket of the water. "Don't let the horses drink from the trough," he said, his voice flat. "Why? What is it?" He set the bucket on the table. The water was clear, but a faint, oily film shimmered on its surface, and it smelled wrong. Sharp, chemical. "What is that?" she whispered. "Lie," he said, or something like it. Enough to sicken a herd, to kill them, if they drank enough. He had found it before any of the cattle had taken more than a sip, but one calf was already down, foaming at the mouth, its sides heaving. Luke stayed with it all night, forcing lard and milk down its throat, his hands gentle, his voice a low murmur, but the animal died just before dawn. He buried it, his movements stiff. Clara watched him from the cabin door. This was not random. This was not trouble. This was a message. They were trying to ruin him, to drive him off the land. "It's Silas, isn't it?" she said when he came back inside, his hands caked with mud and loss. "And Caleb, because of me." "It's because of the land. Clara," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They always wanted this bottom pasture." "They never did this before I came," she said, her voice shaking. "They are punishing you for taking in leftovers." "Do not," he said, his voice a low thunder she had never heard. "Use that word in this house." He slammed the door, making the tin plates rattle on the shelf. He stood at the window, breathing hard, his back to her. "I am sorry," she whispered. "It's not your fault," he said, his anger vanishing, leaving only that terrible, weary quiet. "It's theirs." But the line was drawn. The attack had pushed them even closer. 2 people besieged in a small cabin. And that night, the fragile wall between them broke. The fire was low. Luke sat on the floor, his back against the hearth, oiling his rifle. The click-snick of the metal was the only sound. Clara sat on the cot, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence was unbearable. She could feel him holding himself in, a spring wound so tight it had to snap. He was building a wall, and she was on the outside of it. He was protecting her from the ranchers, but he was also protecting himself from her. "Luke," she said. Her voice was too loud in the small room. He did not stop his work, but his hands paused. "Ma'am, why do you turn away from me?" His hands stilled completely. He slowly set the rifle piece on the cloth beside him. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She stood up. Her heart was a trapped bird against her ribs. She was the girl who had been sent as a joke, the woman her father had sold. She had no right to ask for anything, but she was also the woman who had scraped the fire stain from his home. She was the woman who had slept beside him for a whole winter. She had earned a right to the truth. She walked across the small room and stood in front of him. He did not look up. He stared at the rifle parts. "You bled for me. You work beside me. You let me stay here, but you pull away if I brush your arm. You lie beside me in that bed as if I am a sister, or a ghost. Am I still a joke to you, Luke? Am I so unwanted that even you cannot?" He looked up, and the pain in his eyes silenced her. It was not anger. It was a deep, terrible fear. "Stop," he whispered. "No," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "I have to know. I am tired of being a shadow. I am tired of being a duty you are too kind to abandon. Do you want me, Luke? Or am I just a stray you took in from the cold?" He surged to his feet, a sudden, violent motion that made her step back. He stood over her, his hands clenched at his sides. He was trembling. "Do I want you?" he breathed, his voice raw. He looked at her, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. Not as a problem, or a responsibility, or a guest. He looked at her as a man looks at a woman. He saw the gray flannel dress, the bright blue ribbon in her hair, the fear and fight in her eyes. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer and a curse. "Do I want you? I want you more than I want to breathe. I want you more than I want my next meal, or the sun to rise. I have wanted you since I first saw you standing in the mud, trying not to cry." Her heart stopped. "But I am poison," he choked out, striking his own chest with his fist. "Everything I touch, I burn. I loved Sarah. I loved her, and I left her. I went to check a fence line, and she burned. She died screaming, 'Clara,' and I was not here." He turned away, grabbing the mantle of the hearth, his knuckles white. The beam they had cleaned together was right in front of him. "I brought you into this house, this tomb. And what happens? My cattle are poisoned. My fences are cut. These men, they see you, and they see me, and they want to burn it all down again. And I'm afraid, I am so afraid that if I touch you, if I let myself love you, I will burn you too. I will be the one who sets the fire." He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. He had finally confessed his deepest terror. He was not afraid of Silas. He was not afraid of being ruined. He was afraid of love. He was afraid of himself. Clara looked at his broad, shaking back. She saw the man who had cried in the dark, the man who had gently placed a second blanket over her, the man who had broken his own hand to defend her honor. He was not a man who brought fire. He was a man who had walked out of it, carrying its scars. She did not think. She acted. She stepped up behind him and put her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his rough shirt. He went rigid, as if he had been shot. "You didn't burn her," she whispered against his back. "They did. The bandits. You saved me. You are not fire, Luke. You are the coat. You are the warmth." He shuddered. A long, tearing sound ripped from his throat. He turned in her arms, his face ravaged. He looked down at her, his eyes wild with a war she could only guess at. "Clara," he groaned. She silenced him. She rose on her toes, put her hands on his shoulders, and she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was clumsy. It was her entire life of being unwanted, her entire fear, her entire desperate need to be seen, poured into one act. Her lips were chapped. His were rough. For 1 second, he was frozen, and then he kissed her back. The defense he had held for 3 years did not just crumble, it shattered. It was a dam breaking. A low groan came from deep in his chest, and his arms came around her, crushing her to him. He was not gentle. He was starving. His mouth was on hers, his hands in her hair, pulling the ribbon, his fingers tangling in the long strands. It was a collision of loneliness and a desperate, buried need. He lifted her, his arms like steel bands, and carried her the 2 steps to the cot. He did not set her down. He fell with her onto the soft quilt, his body covering hers, his mouth never leaving hers. "Luke," she breathed, her hands clutching his shirt, his shoulders, his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her throat, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry. Clara, "Don't be," she said, her voice fierce. "Don't you dare be sorry. Just stay with me." He raised his head, his face inches from hers. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, simple hunger that mirrored her own. He was not the ghost. He was the man. "I will," he said. He finally let go of the past. He let go of the fear and the fire. He made love to her with a desperate, gentle hunger that spoke of 3 years of cold nights and a lifetime of unspoken grief. It was not a taking, it was a claiming, and she claimed him just as fiercely, meeting his hunger with her own. It was a turning point, a silent, binding oath made in the shadows of the small cabin, under the watchful eye of the scarred beam. For the first time, the cabin did not feel like a tomb. It felt like a home. In the days that followed, the world was new. The air was softer. The mud seemed less terrible. They moved around each other with a new, quiet grace. The cot was their bed, shared every night. He would wake in the dark, his arm around her, and he would just hold her, his breathing steady, as if to reassure himself she was real. He touched her constantly, simple, grounding touches, a hand on her back as she cooked, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her the coffee, a quick, hard kiss in the dim light of the barn, his lips tasting of leather and salt. The blue ribbon was gone, lost in the night, but he found it under the bed, covered in dust. He cleaned it and tied it himself, his calloused fingers clumsy, around the post of the cot. About a week later, Clara woke with a strange, sour taste in her mouth. She made it to the door just in time, her body heaving, vomiting the small breakfast she had just eaten into the weeds. She leaned against the doorframe, her body weak and trembling. It had happened the day before, too. She was never late. Not ever. She counted the days, her hand pressed against her flat stomach. A cold, terrifying, wonderful realization blood. She was pregnant. She waited until that night to tell him. He was sitting at the table, drawing lines on a piece of paper, planning a new fence line, one that would be harder to cut. The lamp cast a warm, yellow circle of light around him. Luke? He did not look up. I was sick again this morning. He looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. Was it the water? Are you— No, she said, her hands twisted in her apron. It's not the water. I think I am with child. The pencil in his hand snapped. The two pieces fell onto the paper. He did not move. He just stared at her, his face completely, utterly blank. He said nothing. The silence stretched, and Clara's heart sank. It was too soon. He was not ready. He had just let go of one ghost. She was burdening him with a new life. Luke, she whispered, terrified. He just stared. His face was pale. Slowly, he pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked out of the cabin. Grabbing his coat on the way, he did not say a word. He just left. Clara sank onto the cot, the tears she had held back finally coming. He did not want it. He did not want her. The night had been a mistake. She was a fool again. She cried herself to sleep, curled in a miserable ball, the cabin cold without his warmth. She woke to a sound, a rhythmic, scraping sound. Shh, saw, shh, saw. The sun was just rising, painting the room in a pale, gray light. Luke was not in the bed. She sat up. He was outside, near the woodpile. She went to the window. He was working. He had 2 long, smooth planks of pine he must have kept in the barn. He had a saw and was carefully, meticulously, cutting the wood. She watched him for an hour as the sun rose. He worked with a fierce, quiet intensity. He did not stop. He was measuring, cutting, sanding, building something. He came inside around mid-morning, his face tired but set. He did not look at her. He went to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, and brought one to her. I was quiet, he said, his voice low. I needed to think. I understand, she whispered. No, he said, his voice rough. You don't. He looked at her, and his eyes were not afraid. They were clear, and they were fierce. I was making a list of the wood I'd need. He gestured with his head toward the door. She looked, sitting just inside the doorway. The fresh, pale pine glowing in the morning light was a cradle. It was simple, solid, and beautifully made. The rockers were perfectly curved. The wood was sanded so smooth it shined. He had built it all morning. He said, his voice thick. I just had to build it, to make it real. He put his large, rough hand on her stomach, his touch reverent. "A baby," he whispered. Their bond, forged in shame and fire, was now sealed with something new. A tiny, fragile hope. But as their small world grew brighter, the shadows outside grew darker. The cradle sat by the hearth, a symbol of their future. And it was that future, perhaps, that Silas and the others could not stand. The attack came 2 nights later. Clara woke to a smell, the same smell she had nightmares about. Smoke, but this was not the wood smoke of their hearth. This was the acrid, terrible smell of a fast, angry fire. "Luke!" she screamed, shaking him. He was awake instantly. "What?" "Smoke! I smell it!" He was out of the bed in a second, pulling on his boots. He threw open the door. The night sky, which should have been black and full of stars, was a sickening, dancing orange. The barn was on fire. "No," he breathed. The word was a prayer of denial. The flames were already leaping from the hayloft, licking at the roof. "The animals!" Clara shrieked, grabbing the water bucket. "No time!" he roared, grabbing his axe. "Get the horses. I'll get the cow." He ran toward the inferno. Clara, barefoot and in her nightgown, ran with him. The heat was a physical blow. Pushing her back, the roaring sound was deafening. Luke kicked the side door of the barn open. Thick, black smoke poured out. He tied his neckerchief over his face and plunged inside. Clara ran to the corral. The 2 horses were screaming, their eyes wide with terror, rearing and plunging against the fence. "Easy! Easy!" she cried, her voice thin against the roar of the fire. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking, the heat scalding her back. She finally got the gate open, smacking the horses on their rumps. "Go! Go!" They bolted into the dark field, wild with fear. Luke emerged from the smoke, coughing, dragging the terrified cow by her rope. "Clara, get back!" "Luke." A section of the roof collapsed. A shower of sparks and burning hay rained down. He shoved the cow clear and turned back. "Luke, no! Get out!" she screamed. "The saddle! The tools!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. Their entire livelihood, everything they needed to survive, was in that barn. He charged back into the smoke. Clara stood frozen, watching the place where he had vanished. The barn was a volcano, spitting fire and ash. He was not coming out. He was gone. The same fire that took Sarah was taking him. "Luke!" He burst out of the smoke, his shirt smoldering, his arms full of tack and tools, his face black with soot. He threw the things on the ground and fell to his knees, coughing, his lungs raw. Clara ran to him, beating out the small embers on his shirt with her bare hands, not feeling the sting. "You fool! You God-cursed fool!" she sobbed, pulling him away. They collapsed on the wet spring ground, 100 yards away, and watched it burn. They had saved the animals, but the barn, the hay, the grain, their winter stores, all of it was gone. It burned until the sun came up, leaving only a smoking black skeleton against the pale blue sky. They were ruined. They sat there for a long time, covered in soot, shivering. Luke stared at the ashes, his face blank, the way it had been when she told him about the baby. He finally looked at her. Her nightgown was torn, her feet were bleeding, her face was a mask of soot and tears. He reached out and touched her cheek, his finger leaving a clean track on her skin. He knew who had done this. It was not just about land. It was not just jealousy. It was Silas. It was the laughter. It was a cruelty so deep it could only be answered with fire. Clara's teeth were chattering. From cold. From fear. She looked at the smoldering ruins, then back at the small cabin where the cradle sat. "If they never stop," she whispered, her voice broken. "If they never stop laughing, what do we do? Where do we go?" Luke looked at the ashes for a long time. He looked at the vast, empty land around them, and the hostile town just over the rise. Then he looked at her, and the baby she carried. He pulled her to her feet. His face was hard, cut from the same granite as the mountains. "We stay," he said. "We build it again." He pulled her close, his arms a steel band around her, and he rested his chin on the top of her smoky hair. "We outlive their cruelty. We outlive their cruelty." The words had been a promise, a declaration of war against the ashes. They had started to clear the rubble the very next day, their hands raw, their faces smudged with soot. They would build again. The cradle sat inside the cabin, a silent promise of why. The hope was fragile, but it was real. It was a single, tiny flame in a world that wanted to snuff it out. The fire came 3 days later, not a fire of wood and hay, but an internal one. It started as a dull ache in her lower back, a familiar discomfort she mistook for weariness. She had been lifting charred beams all morning, her muscles screaming. She went to the creek to fetch water, and the ache became a cramp, a sharp, twisting fist deep inside her. She set the bucket down, her breathing catching. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. It is too soon." Another cramp seized her, harder this time, forcing the air from her lungs. She leaned against a birch tree, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She looked down. A dark, spreading stain of red was soaking through the gray flannel of her skirt. It was not a spot, it was a flow, bright and terrible. The world went silent. The sound of the creek, the wind in the pines, all of it vanished, replaced by a high, thin ringing in her ears. The baby, their baby, the small, secret hope. She was losing it. It was not just a loss, it was a failure. Her body, which had been a joke, which had been sold, which had finally found a purpose, was betraying her. It was worthless. A wave of sickness and a profound, agonizing shame washed over her. She could not go back to the cabin. She could not face Luke. She could not show him this final proof of her inadequacy. He had lost his wife to fire, his barn to fire, and now the child she was supposed to give him was being washed away by this internal, bloody tide. He had been right. He brought death, and she was just as broken. She turned from the cabin and walked. She did not know where she was going. She left the bucket by the tree and stumbled into the woods, away from the smoking ruins of the barn, away from the cabin that held the empty cradle. She walked until the cramps forced her to her knees. She crawled behind a cluster of massive granite boulders, into a small, dark space hidden by pine boughs. She curled up on the cold, damp earth, her arms wrapped around her stomach, as if she could physically hold the life inside her. But it was no use. The bleeding was heavy, the pain a relentless, tearing wave. She was alone, just as she had been when she arrived, a poor fool, unwanted, useless. She sobbed. It was not the quiet, stifled sound of the cabin. It was a raw, animal wail of grief and self-hatred that tore from her throat. She wept for the child she would never hold, for the cradle that would never be filled. She wept for her own broken body, convinced it was a punishment. She had been sent as a joke, and this was the universe agreeing. Her body was worthless. She lay there for hours. The sun moved across the sky. The air grew cold. The pain subsided into a dull, hollow ache. The flow of blood slowed, but it did not stop. She was empty. She was cold. She was nothing. Luke had seen her go to the creek. He had seen the bucket, abandoned. He had seen the small, unsteady tracks leading into the woods. He had seen the first spots of blood on the moss. His heart, which he thought had been hardened by fire and loss, turned to ice. "Clara!" he breathed. It was not a call. It was a prayer. He tracked her easily, his long strides eating up the ground. He found her behind the rocks, a small, gray bundle of misery curled on the ground. She was pale, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her skirt stained dark. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes were vacant. shattered. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. I lost it. I am sorry. Luke, I am so sorry. I am worthless." He did not speak. His face was a mask of such profound, terrible anguish that it mirrored her own. He knelt on the cold ground, his knees sinking into the damp pine needles. He reached for her. She flinched. "Do not," she sobbed. I am unclean. I failed you." "Hush," he said, his voice breaking. He did not care about the blood. He did not care about any of it. He saw only her, broken and freezing, blaming herself for a cruelty that belonged to the world, not to her. He pulled her into his arms. He lifted her from the ground as if she weighed nothing and sat, pulling her onto his lap, his back against the cold granite. He wrapped his arms around her, pressing her face against his chest, rocking her like a child. "It is not your fault," he whispered, his voice thick. "It is not, it is worthless," she choked out against his shirt. "No," he said, his grip tightening, his own tears falling hot into her hair. "You are not, do you hear me, Clara? You are not." He held her. He held her as the last of the light faded from the sky. He held her as she sobbed until she had no tears left. He held her as her body, exhausted from the physical and emotional trauma, finally went limp. He held her as she passed out, her breath a small, shallow puff against his neck. He carried her home in the darkness. He did not look at the empty cradle. He laid her on the cot, gently cleaned her face with a damp cloth, and stripped off her stained clothes, covering her with the quilt. He did not see her as a woman. He saw her as a wound, something precious that had been torn open, and his only thought was to keep her warm, to keep her safe. He sat on the floor beside the cot all night, his hand on her arm, just to feel her breathe. The recovery was slow. It was a descent into a gray, silent fog. Clara did not leave the cot for 3 days. She was weak, the loss of blood leaving her pale and dizzy. But the physical emptiness was nothing compared to the emotional void. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Luke tended to her with a quiet, desperate care. He made her broth, spooning it into her mouth when she refused to eat. He changed the cloths, his face grim, his movements gentle. He did not speak of the baby. He did not speak of the blood. He just stayed. On the 4th day, she sat up. The cabin was clean. Luke was outside, splitting wood. His axe strokes were not steady. They were violent, angry, each thud a punctuation of rage. She looked across the small room. The cradle. It sat by the hearth, a pale, beautiful promise. Now a monument to their failure. It was the saddest thing she had ever seen. When Luke came back in, his arms full of wood, he saw her staring at it. His face tightened. He said nothing. He went to the cradle, picked it up, and took it outside. She heard the sound of his axe again, a sharp, splintering crack, just once. He came back in, his hands empty. He had broken it. He had destroyed the promise. He sat at the table, his head in his hands. "I am sorry, Clara," he whispered, his voice muffled. "It was not your fault," she said, her own voice a lifeless echo. "Yes, it was." He looked up, and his eyes were the eyes of the man who had cried in the dark, the man who had lost Sarah. "It is me. I did this. I brought you here. I bring death. I bring it to everyone I love." "That is not true," she said, but her voice was weak. "Is it not?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Sarah, the calf, the barn, and now this child. It never had a chance. Not with me, not in this cursed life." He was not angry at her. He was angry at God, at the world, at himself. He was drowning in his own guilt, and she was too weak to pull him out. Their grief was a third person in the room, a cold, heavy presence. It did not break them, It bound them in a new, strange way. They sat by the fire every night, not speaking. Words were useless. There was nothing to say. Touch replaced words. He would sit on the floor, and she would sit on the cot, her bare feet resting on his thigh. He would just lay his hand over her ankles. A warm, heavy weight. A promise. "I am still here." She would reach out and rest her hand on his shoulder as he stared into the fire. "I am still here." They were two survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of driftwood. The passion they had found was gone, burned away, leaving only this deep, silent, shared sorrow. They ran out of flour. They ran out of salt. The small garden she had dreamed of was just cold mud. The world did not stop because they were grieving. "I have to go to town," she said one morning, her voice rusty. It had been 2 weeks. Luke's head snapped up. "No, I will go." "No," she said, and her voice was quiet. But it was not weak. It was cold. "You cannot. They will provoke you. You will fight. You might not come back. It has to be me. I have to trade. I have to trade the needles." "The sewing needles, Mrs." Abernathy had sent. They were the only thing of value she had. He did not argue. He saw the new, hard thing in her eyes. He just nodded. "Be careful." "I am not the same woman who arrived here. Luke," she said. The walk to Dry Creek was long. The mud sucked at her boots. She felt the eyes of the town on her before she even reached the main street. The women, who had once looked away in pity, now stared with a cold curiosity. They knew about the fire. They had probably heard about the loss. News traveled like wildfire. She was the rancher's woman, Luke's whore, the joke that had taken root. She walked into the general store, her head high, her back straight. The storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, was behind the counter. Silas was there, in the corner, drinking from a bottle, his boots up on a barrel of crackers. He saw her, and a slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. Clara ignored him. She walked to the counter. Mrs. Abernathy, the woman who had spat near her boots, was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Abernathy," Clara said, her voice clear, "I need flour and salt. I have these to trade." She placed the small packet of needles on the counter. Mr. Abernathy looked at the needles. He looked at Silas. He looked back at her. His face was a mixture of pity and contempt. "Needles," he said, drawing the word out. "They are fine steel." Clara said, "Hard to come by." Silas laughed from the corner. A low, wet chuckle. "Looks like Luke's luck has run dry. Burned him out. Now he's sending his woman in to trade sewing supplies. What is next? Clara, you going to trade that ribbon in your hair?" Clara's hand instinctively went to her hair. She had put it in that morning. The blue ribbon, a desperate attempt to feel human. "That is not your concern," she said, her voice shaking. Mr. Abernathy looked uncomfortable, but he was more afraid of Silas than he was of her. He sighed, as if she were a great burden. He pushed the needles back toward her. "I cannot give you flour for these," he said. "Then what?" she asked, her desperation growing. "We need food." $1, he said. $1 for flour and salt." "I do not have $1, she whispered. Mr. Abernathy looked at Silas again, who gave a slight nod. The storekeeper reached into his pocket and pulled out a single coin, a quarter. He did not place it on the counter. He held it up, between his thumb and forefinger. "This," he said, his voice full of a sudden, righteous spite, "is what your needles are worth. It is what you are worth." And he threw the coin at her. It struck her chest, a small, cold sting, and fell to the floor, ringing once on the wooden planks before it was still. Clara stared at the coin. "That's all you're worth." The world stopped. She heard the echo of the woman's voice. "You poor fool." She heard the rancher's laughter. She heard her father's voice. Unwanted baggage? And now this. A coin, thrown at her like she was a beggar, or worse. She looked at the coin. She looked at the storekeeper. She looked at Silas, who was smiling, his teeth brown. She did not cry. She did not flush. The shame that had been her constant companion for her entire life simply burned away. It was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and pure. Rage. She did not bend down to pick up the coin. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the store. She left the needles. She left the coin. She walked out into the muddy street, her head high, and began the long walk home, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She did not cry. She walked in silence. Luke was waiting on the porch. He saw her empty hands. He saw her face. "Clara?" She walked past him into the cabin. She went to the post of the cot, where the blue ribbon was tied. It was the color of a mountain lake. It was the thing that had made her feel nice. She untied it. "Clara, what happened?" Luke asked, following her, his voice tight with dread. She held the ribbon, one end in each hand. "He threw a coin at me," she said, her voice flat, dead. "The storekeeper, he said, 'That is what I am worth.'" Luke's face went dark. "I will kill him." "No," she said. She pulled her hands apart. The beautiful silk, a symbol of his first gentle kindness, ripped in two. Rip. The sound was as violent as a gunshot in the quiet cabin. She looked at the two pieces of blue fabric in her hands. Then she looked at him, and her eyes were not the eyes of the woman he had saved. They were the eyes of a wolf. "I will not be silent," she said. "I will not be a victim. I will not be a joke, or a shadow, or a thing to be pitied. You were wrong, Luke. We cannot just outlive them." She threw the pieces of the ribbon into the cold hearth. "We have to fight them. If we stay silent, they win. They win. And they take everything. They took our child. They took our barn. They will not stop until they take this house, this land. Until they take us." Luke stared at her, at the fire in her, a fire that had not been there before. The grief had burned her down to the studs, and what was left was steel. She had torn the ribbon. She had declared war, and in that moment, his own grief, his own guilt, receded. She was right. Silence was a luxury they could not afford. He nodded, a single, slow acknowledgement. The next morning, he took his rifle from the wall. He took her outside. "You are right," he said. He handed her the gun. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined. The wood was smooth, the metal cold. "I do not know how," she said. "I will teach you." She was awkward. The rifle was long, and it unbalanced her. Her shoulders ached, but she was determined. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to sight down the long barrel. "Squeeze," he said, his hand on her shoulder. "Do not pull. Squeeze." Her first shot was a deafening roar that slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, knocking her back. The bullet hit the dirt 10 feet wide of the tin can he had set on a log. "Again," he said. She did it again, and again. She practiced until her shoulder was a mass of purple bruises, until her ears rang, until she could reload the weapon in the dark. She was not a good shot, but she was determined. She would not be helpless again. While she practiced, Luke rode out. He did not ride to town. He rode to the land office in the next county, a full day's ride. He returned 3 days later, his face grim but satisfied. He had a sheaf of papers in his saddlebag. "What is that?" Clara asked, wiping gun oil from her hands. "Silas and his friends. They run their cattle on the West Range," he said. "They think it is theirs, but it is open land, government land. But they have always used it." "Using is not owning," Luke said. He spread the papers on the table. They were legal forms, covered in stamps and signatures. I filed a claim, a homestead claim, on the 160 acres that hold their only clean water source, the spring on the West Range. It is ours." Clara stared. This was not a fist fight in a saloon. This was not anger. This was strategy. He was not just fighting back. He was taking their power. He was using their own laws against them. She realized, in that moment, that their fight was not just personal. It was not just about her shame or his grief. It was about power. It was about who had the right to exist, to build, to own. "They will not let this stand. Luke," she said, her voice quiet. "I know," he said. "Let them come." A week later, the mail rider, a boy who rarely stopped, left a packet in their box. It was a letter, addressed to her. The handwriting was fine, elegant. It was from Philadelphia. It was from her sister, Eleanor. She opened it with trembling hands. Luke watched her, his face wary. She read. It was not a long letter. It was cold, formal. Eleanor wrote that their father had passed away 2 months prior, a sickness of the lung. He had died in her home. Clara felt a small, distant pang of grief, but it was overshadowed by the rest of the letter. He had left no money for her. He had left her nothing at all. There was only, Eleanor wrote, a single line in the will, addressed to her. "My daughter Clara has disgraced our family. She is no longer kin to me. She disgraced us." The words were a final blow from a life she had already left behind. She had not been a joke. She had been a disgrace. She lowered the letter, the paper shaking. She had been cut off. Formally, finally, she was truly, completely alone, an outcast from her own blood. Luke saw her face, the way the last of her old self seemed to drain away. He took the letter from her hand. He read the single line. His face hardened. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not offer comfort. He walked to the hearth, struck a match, and lit the corner of the paper. He held it as the flames consumed Eleanor's elegant script, as their father's final judgment turned to black, floating ash. He dropped the last burning corner into the hearth and looked at her. "You are not what they made you," he said. "You are not a disgrace. You are not a joke. You are the woman who learned to shoot. You are the woman who owns their water. You are my wife." He had never called her that before. "You are a homesteader," he said, "and this is our land." She did not write the letter with a shaking hand. Her hand was steady. The grief and rage had burned away the last of her fear. She used the small pencil Luke kept for his ledgers, and a piece of brown wrapping paper, the only paper they had. The words were simple. She wrote them, crossed them out, and wrote them again. Not because she was unsure, but because she wanted them to be as clean and sharp as a bone. "I was Clara Jensen. I was sent here as a joke. I was called a fool, and I was laughed at. I had nothing. I stayed because one man, Luke, saw me as human." She did not sign her new name. She did not need to. The entire town of Dry Creek knew who she was. She put on her boots, the ones Luke had patched with a piece of leather from an old saddle. She put on her gray flannel dress. She did not wear the jacket. She wanted them to see her. She took the small piece of paper and walked out of the cabin. Luke watched her go. He was cleaning the rifle. Again, he did not ask where she was going. He knew. Her walk was different. Her shoulders were back. She was not the woman who had stumbled off the stagecoach, a bundle of thin wool and raw nerves. She was a landowner. She was a woman who had survived a fire, a loss, and a humiliation that would have broken most. The walk to town did not feel long. The mud was drying, and the air was crisp. She saw the town, that small collection of unpainted buildings, not as a place of judgment, but as a place that was beneath her. She walked past the general store. Mr. Abernathy was sweeping the porch. He saw her and stopped, his broom hovering over the wood. He looked down, avoiding her gaze. He looked ashamed. She did not grant him a glance. She walked to the saloon. It was mid-morning. It was quiet. The sound of her boots on the boardwalk was loud. She pushed the swinging doors open. The room went silent. It was dark, smelling of stale beer and old smoke. 3 men were at a table, playing cards. The bartender, Sam, was wiping the counter. And in the back, in his usual corner, sat Silas. His chair scraped as he recognized her. He was not smiling. His face was a dark cloud of resentment. Luke's legal claim on the spring had cut him deep, had made him a fool in the eyes of the other ranchers. And here was the cause of it, walking into his domain. "Get out," Silas growled. "We don't serve your kind." Clara ignored him. She walked past the card players. She walked past the bar. She walked to the wall by the door, a wall covered in wanted posters, auction notices, and lists of stray cattle. She pulled a small tack from her pocket, one she had taken from Luke's shed. She pressed the brown paper against the wood and, with the heel of her hand, punched the tack in. It was done. She turned. Every eye in the room was on her. She looked directly at Silas. Her gaze was not angry. It was not fearful. It was cold. "I am not a joke," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the small room. "I am not a disgrace. I am Mrs. Clara Murray, and you are trespassing on my husband's land." She turned and walked out. The swinging doors flapped shut behind her, leaving a stunned, heavy silence. The letter was a stone dropped in a stagnant pond. The ripples spread slowly, but they were deep. The men, led by Silas, were furious. They tore the note down, but Sam, the bartender, a man who saw everything and said little, had read it, and he told the story. The card players told the story. The story was no longer about a joke. It was about a woman who had stood up. The women of Dry Creek, who had been silent accomplices in her humiliation, were the ones who truly heard the words. They were women who knew what it was to be overlooked, to be undervalued, to live under the hard thumbs of men like Silas. The first sign was a quiet nod. 2 women, passing her on the street as she left the saloon, did not look away. They did not spit. They looked her in the eye and gave a short, sharp nod of respect. The next day, there was a knock on the cabin door. Luke grabbed the rifle. Clara opened the door a crack. It was a woman she did not know, thin and severe in a dark dress, her hair in a tight bun. She looked like a field bird. "Mrs. Murray?" the woman asked, her voice quiet. "Yes. I am Miss Evans. I am the school teacher." The woman was nervous, clutching a small basket. I read your letter, or I heard of it. It was a brave thing to do." She held out the basket. Inside, nestled in a bit of cloth, were 6 brown eggs. "I do not have much," Miss Evans said, her eyes darting to the woods, as if afraid of being seen. "But no one should have to trade needles for flour. Mr. Abernathy is a coward. Ruled by Silas. We are all cowards." Clara was stunned. She took the basket. "Thank you." "Your husband's claim on the spring. It was just," the schoolteacher whispered. "Those men are bullies. Be careful." She turned and hurried away, a small, brave shadow. Clara closed the door, holding the eggs as if they were jewels. She looked at Luke. He was lowering the rifle, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. "A school teacher," Clara said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "Eggs," Luke replied. It was the first crack in the wall of their isolation. It was the first time anyone from that town had shown them kindness. But kindness, they would learn, was more dangerous than cruelty. Silas and his men could not stand it. They had lost the water. They had been defied by Luke in a fist fight. They had been legally outmaneuvered by him at the land office. And now, this woman, this joke, was turning the town against them. She had posted a letter, and the school teacher was giving her eggs. She was gaining respect. Their humiliation was complete, and a humiliated man is a desperate one. The retaliation came 3 nights later. The moon was a sliver, hidden by clouds. The air was heavy, still. Luke was asleep, a deep, exhausted sleep. Clara was awake, her ears tuned to the night. She heard it first, not a gunshot, not a yell, the crunch of a boot on gravel, a sound that did not belong. She sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. "Luke!" He was awake instantly. "What?" "Outside," she whispered. "Someone is outside." He was out of the bed, pulling on his trousers, grabbing the rifle. He moved to the window, peering into the blackness. "I see them," he hissed. 4, no, 5 of them, near the woodpile. They have guns. Clara's blood went cold. They were not coming with fire this time. They were coming for them. "Clara," he said, his voice low and calm, the voice of a man who had faced death before. "Get the shotgun. Go to the back window. Do not fire unless I tell you. Do not fire unless they try to come in. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said, her voice a thin thread. She grabbed the heavy shotgun he had been teaching her to use. It was loaded. She moved to the small window at the back of the cabin, her hands slick with sweat, her shoulder already aching in memory of the recoil. "We know you are in there. Luke!" Silas's voice boomed through the night. "You and your whore, you think you can steal our water? You think you can turn this town against us?" "This is my land! Silas!" Luke yelled back, his voice tight. "You are trespassing! The sheriff knows it! Get off my property!" "The sheriff is asleep!" another voice yelled. "Caleb, and you are finished. We are burning you out for good." A rock shattered the front window. Clara screamed. "Stay down," Luke commanded. A shot rang out. A bullet thwacked into the log wall, just above Luke's head. "That is it," Luke said, his voice cold. He raised his rifle to the shattered window. "Clara, stay down!" He fired. The explosion was deafening inside the cabin. A yell of rage came from outside. The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the cabin. Wood splintered. Their few tin plates were blasted off the shelf. Clara curled into a small ball under the window, her hands over her head, the shotgun useless on the floor beside her. She was terrified. This was not practice. This was a war. "Clara!" Luke roared over the noise. "The back! They are at the back door!" She heard it, a heavy thud as someone threw their shoulder against the back door. "Luke." "Shoot, Clara! Shoot through the door! Now!" She scrambled for the gun. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely lift it. She heard the wood of the door begin to split. He was going to break it down. She closed her eyes, pointed the heavy gun at the door, and squeezed both triggers. The recoil was a mule kick, throwing her backward onto the floor. The sound was a cannon blast, the cabin filled with acrid smoke. A scream, a terrible high-pitched scream, not of rage but of pure, agonizing pain. The shooting outside stopped. "Billy!" a man's voice shrieked. "Oh God! Billy! He is hit! You shot him! You shot my boy!" It was not Silas. It was one of the other ranchers. "Stop shooting!" Luke yelled. "We have a man down." The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. There was only the sound of a boy sobbing in the dark. "It hurts! Pa, it hurts!" Clara pushed herself up. Her shoulder was numb. Her ears were ringing. I shot someone," she whispered, her stomach turning to water. "Luke, I shot someone." "You shot at the door. Clara, you did what you had to." Headlights cut through the darkness. A wagon. Coming fast. It was the sheriff. The gunfire had finally been enough to wake him, to force his hand. "What in God's name is going on here?" Sheriff Brody yelled, his voice heavy with sleep and reluctance. He held a lantern high. The light illuminated a nightmare. Silas and Caleb stood with their guns, frozen. Another man was on his knees, holding a boy who was clutching his leg. Blood was everywhere. It was Billy, the man's son. He could not have been more than 16. "He shot my boy," the man cried, pointing at Luke. "They attacked us." "Sheriff," Luke said, stepping out of the cabin, his hands up, his rifle pointing at the ground. "They came onto my land, 5 of them, and opened fire. They tried to break down my door. My wife fired a shotgun to defend us." Sheriff Brody looked at the bullet-riddled cabin. He looked at the 5 armed men. He looked at the wounded, crying boy. He was a lazy man, a man who preferred to turn a blind eye. But this was undeniable. This was attempted murder. "Silas," the sheriff sighed, pulling his own gun. "Caleb, you and your men, you are under arrest." "You cannot be serious," Silas blustered. "He stole our water." "And you tried to kill him for it. Put the guns down, all of you." The fight was over. As the men sullenly dropped their rifles, a second wagon appeared. A woman was driving it, lashing the horse. It was the boy's mother. "Billy!" she screamed, jumping down before the wagon had even stopped. She ran to her son. Clara watched from the doorway, her body numb. She had done this. She had shot this boy. She looked at the mother, weeping over her child, and her rage, her fear, it all dissolved. "He is just a boy," she whispered. She turned and went back into the cabin. Pushing past Luke, she grabbed a clean cloth, the whiskey, and the water basin. She walked back outside, past her husband, past the sheriff, and knelt in the dirt beside the crying boy. "Let me see," she said. The mother looked up, her face a mask of hatred. You did this!" "I am trying to help," Clara said, her voice steady. "Let me help him." The boy, Billy, looked at her, his face pale with pain. "Please," he whimpered. Clara gently pushed the father's hands away. "Hold the lantern, Sheriff." She cut the boy's trouser leg open. The blast had been wide, the pellets tearing up his thigh. It was bad. It was bloody, but it was not fatal. "He will live," she said. She poured the whiskey over the wound. The boy screamed, but she did not flinch. "Hold him," she told the father. She began to clean the wound, her hands, which had been so clumsy with the rifle, now steady and sure. She worked quickly, her face a calm, focused mask. The boy's mother watched her. She watched this woman, this joke, this whore, calmly and gently saving her son's life, her face streaked with soot, her cabin shot to pieces. The mother's hatred crumbled, replaced by a profound, shaking shame. I, the mother stammered. "I heard what my husband, what Silas, I said things about you." Clara did not look up. She was tying the bandage. "Hold this tight," she told the father. "I was wrong," the mother wept, sinking to her knees. "I was wrong about you. God forgive me. I was wrong." Clara finished the knot. She finally looked at the woman. She did not offer forgiveness. She did not offer comfort. She just gave a small, tired nod. She had not done it for the mother. She had done it for the boy. Luke watched his wife. He saw the strength in her, a strength that ran deeper than his own. He had taught her to shoot, but she had a conscience he had lost long ago. He looked at his cabin, the walls scarred with bullet holes. He looked at Silas, his face murderous even as the sheriff bound his hands. This was not a victory. They realized the land was no longer safe. The sheriff took the men, and the wagon took the boy and his parents. Dawn was breaking. The cabin was a wreck, splintered wood, broken glass, the smell of gunpowder. Luke sat at the table, his head in his hands. "They will be out," he said, his voice dead. "Brody will have to let them go. A judge will set bail, and they will be back." "We will fight them again," Clara said, sweeping up the glass. "No." He looked up. His face aged 10 years in one night. They will not come with guns next time. They know we will shoot. They will come with torches. They will burn this cabin with us inside it. This land. It is poisoned. Clara, our claim. It will never be safe. He stood and pulled an old, creased map from the trunk. He spread it on the table. The Riverlands, he said, his finger tracing a line west. 100 miles from here. Good water, good grass. No one knows us. No one knows our story. We can start over. A new cabin, a new life. Clara looked at the map. She looked at the small, shattered room. This place was not a home. It was a grave for his first wife, a grave for their child. It was a place of fire and blood. She placed her hand over his on the map. We leave, she said, now. They had little to pack. A few clothes, the tools Luke had saved from the fire, the cast-iron skillet, and the coffee pot. They had one horse left, the roan. They would have to ride together. Before they left, Clara said, I have one more thing to do. He did not ask. He just saddled the horse. She walked into Dry Creek for the last time. The sun was up. The town was buzzing with the news of the night's shooting. People stared at her, but the stares were different. They were not mocking. They were afraid. They were awed. She pushed open the saloon doors. It was the same as before. Sam, the bartender. A few men. Mr. Abernathy was there, his face pale. She walked to the counter. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the 2 torn, faded pieces of the blue ribbon. She laid them on the dark, wet wood, right where the coin had been thrown. She looked at the men, one by one. You laughed, she said, her voice quiet, but it cut through the room. You all laughed, but I found a man who wrapped me in his coat. She turned and walked out, leaving the pieces of her old self, her old shame, on the bar. That night, they did not sleep in the cabin. Luke built a fire one last time. A small, clean fire on the land he had bled for, far from the ashes of the barn. The horse was packed, ready to leave before sunrise. They sat and watched the flames. The stars were bright, a cold, sharp canopy above them. The world was huge, and they were very small. Clara moved closer to him, resting her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. She kissed him, a slow, deep kiss under the stars. It was a kiss of partnership, of a shared future, of a past they were finally, truly, leaving behind. You didn't save me, Luke, she whispered, her gaze on the fire. Back there, on that first day, I was so broken. I thought you saved me. He looked at her, his face lit by the orange glow. But you did not, she said. You wrapped me in your coat. You gave me a place to stand, a place to be warm. I was the one who chose to heal. I chose to fight. I chose to live. Luke pulled her tighter, kissing the top of her head. He looked at the cabin, a dark shape against the sky, a tomb of memories. Then he looked west, toward the unseen riverlands. Then let's go live, Clara, he said. They rode east for 2 days before turning south, then west, avoiding any trail that might lead back to Dry Creek. They moved like shadows, speaking little, their faces turned toward the unknown. In a town called Junction, a place with no memory of their names. Luke sold the roan. The horse was his last connection to the old life, to Sarah, and he parted with it for a price that was far too low. But it was enough. It bought them a sway-backed mule, a rickety wagon with one wobbly wheel, and a meager pile of supplies: flour, salt, coffee, and 2 axes. The journey west was a new kind of hardship. It was not the sharp, sudden violence of men. It was the slow, grinding cruelty of the land itself. The sun was a hammer. The nights were a frozen, breathless cold. They did not ride. They walked, side by side, the mule pulling their few possessions. Clara's boots, the ones from her old life. fell apart, the soles flapping. She bound them with scraps of burlap, and then walked barefoot when the burlap wore through. Luke gave her his own boots and wrapped his feet in cloth. They spoke of practical things: water, shelter, the mule. They were a team, a single unit of survival. When he hunted, she made the fire. When she tended to his blistered, bleeding feet, he mended the harness. The wagon was a constant trial. The wobbly wheel finally splintered in the middle of a dry, alkali flat. 100 miles from anything, Clara sat on a rock, the wind whipping her hair, and felt the old, familiar despair creep in. "It is over," she said, her voice flat. "We cannot walk from here." Luke, his face cracked by the sun, his lips split, just looked at the broken wheel. He had his axe. He looked at the useless wagon bed. "No," he said. He spent the next 2 days in the blistering sun, carving a new wheel. He hacked it from the floorboards of the wagon itself, sacrificing the structure to save the journey. He carved a crude, solid circle of wood. It was not a wheel, it was a thud. It did not roll, it dragged, but it held. They crossed a river that was high with spring melt. The water was fast and brown and cold as death. The mule balked, its eyes wide. Luke did not hesitate. He unloaded their precious, dwindling supplies, carrying each sack across on his back, the water slamming into his chest, threatening to pull him under. Clara watched, her heart in her throat, convinced she was about to be a widow. He made 4 trips. On the last one, he carried her. She clung to his back, her face pressed against his neck, the icy water numbing her legs. And she felt the shudder of his muscles as he fought the current. He did not stumble. He did not falter. He just moved forward, one slow, agonizing step at a time, until he deposited her on the far bank. They lay there, gasping, soaked and freezing, but they were across. They survived, together. They found the land after 6 weeks of walking. They had crested a long, low rise, and the world simply opened up. Below them, a wide, sweeping plain of green grass stretched as far as the eye could see, ending in a smudge of purple hills on the horizon. A creek, clear and bright, snaked through the tall grass, lined with cottonwoods. It was quiet. It was the deepest, most profound quiet Clara had ever known. It was the sound of wind, water, and grass. There was no saloon. There were no voices. There were no ghosts. Luke stood beside her, his hand shielding his eyes. He breathed in, a long, slow breath, as if he were tasting the air. "This is it," he whispered. "Yes," Clara said. There was no need to say more. They made a camp by the creek. Luke unhitched the mule, which brayed with relief and plunged its face into the clean water. For 3 days, they did nothing but rest and eat and watch. They watched the sun rise, painting the plain in shades of apricot and rose. They watched the herds of antelope move like shadows in the distance. They watched the hawks circle in the endless blue sky. "There are no scars here," Clara said one evening, washing their plates in the creek. "No," Luke said, "not yet." He started the cabin the next day. He chose a spot on a gentle slope, overlooking the plain, a cluster of tall pines at its back to break the wind. He would not use sod. He would not use scavenged wood. He went into the hills with his axe and the mule, and he came back with fresh-felled pine. The logs were straight and pale, the sap still sticky on the bark, smelling of resin and earth. He worked from sunup to sundown. Clara worked beside him. She had never built a house. He taught her. He taught her how to notch the logs, how to mix the mud and straw for chinking. Her hands, which had been raw from the journey, became calloused and strong. She found a flat, smooth rock for a doorstep. He built the hearth first, with stones from the creek, mortaring them with a skill that surprised her. It was a wide, deep fireplace, built to hold a fire that gave warmth, not one that threatened. He did not build a cot. He built a bed frame wide and strong, pegged into the corner. There was no charred beam. There was no memory of a fire. Every piece of wood was new. Every log was sound. They were not rebuilding a life that had been destroyed. They were building a new one, from the ground up, with their own 4 hands. When it was finished, it was beautiful. It was just one room, like the old cabin, but it was larger. The window he cut faced east to greet the morning sun. The floor was packed earth, but it was smooth and clean. The night they moved in, they stood in the doorway, their work done. "It is a good house, Luke," Clara said, her voice thick. He did not look at the house. He looked at her. He pulled her close and held her, his face buried in her hair. "It is our home, Clara," he said. Life found its rhythm. The land was good to them. The first spring, Clara turned the rich soil near the creek and planted a garden. She planted beans and squash, corn and potatoes. She planted the things they needed to survive. And in a small patch by the door, she planted a packet of wildflower seeds, bought with the last 2 pennies from the sale of the roan. Luke bought 20 head of cattle from a traveling drover, trading his labor, a month of his time, to get them. He rode the wide, open plain, his herd growing, his face weathered, his eyes quiet. He was a rancher again. In the long evenings, Clara began to write. She had no paper, so she'd use the insides of the flour sacks, flattened and washed. She wrote with a stub of pencil, her hand moving quickly. She did not write about Dry Creek. She did not write about the fire or the blood. She wrote about the way the wind moved the grass, the color of the sky before a storm, the feeling of her bare feet in the cool mud of her garden. She wrote about a quiet man who knew how to build a house and how to hold a woman who was breaking. A family traveling the new trail stopped, their wagon broken. Luke, the man who had carved a wheel from his own wagon bed, fixed theirs. The wife, Martha, had 3 small children, all of them dirty and thin, their eyes wide with fear of the trail. Clara brought them into the cabin. She gave them stew. She saw the mother's hopeless gaze. "They cannot read," Martha whispered, ashamed. I cannot teach them." "I can," Clara said. And so, she became a teacher. The family stayed, building their own small cabin a mile down the creek. Word spread on the trail. Murray's place was a safe stop. Luke Murray was a man who could fix a wheel. Clara Murray was a woman who could teach your children, who would give you a hot meal and not ask your story. Their small homestead grew. It was not a town. It was a community, an outcast family from Missouri, accused of sympathies they did not hold, a young man who had run away from a life in the East, a woman who had lost her husband to the trail. Misfits, outcasts, travelers. Clara became the heart of the settlement. She was the one who was called when a child was sick. She was the one who settled disputes. She was the one who sat with the women, her hands busy with mending, her voice a calm, steady presence. She had been the joke, the woman no one saw. Now, she was the woman everyone turned to. They never spoke of Dry Creek. It was a locked box, buried deep under the new, rich soil, but the scars remained. Luke still stared at the fire. He would sit at the hearth in their new, clean cabin, his eyes fixed on the flames, his body tense. He was not seeing the warm, dancing light. He was seeing another fire, hearing other screams. Clara would come and sit beside him, not speaking, and just lay her hand on his knee. He would start, as if waking, and then his hand would cover hers, his thumb rubbing her knuckles, and the tension would leave him. Clara's scar was laughter. One night, a group of drovers camped by the creek, loud and full of whiskey. Their laughter, the harsh, barking sound of careless men, drifted up to the cabin. Clara, who had been kneading bread, went stiff. Her hands stopped. The blood drained from her face. She was back in the mud, in the cold, with Silas's men pointing at her. Luke, who was reading one of her few books by the lamplight, saw it. He did not say a word. He got up, took his rifle from the wall, and walked outside. Clara ran to the door. "Luke, no!" He did not go to the drovers. He just stood on the porch, the rifle held in the crook of his arm, a tall, silent shadow. He did not move. He just stood watch. The drovers, sensing a presence, quieted their noise and moved on at sunrise. He came back inside. "It is all right," he said, putting the rifle back. "No one will laugh at you here." She went to him, her hands white with flour, and put her arms around his waist. "Thank you," she whispered. One night, the wind howled, a high, thin sound that reminded her of the cabin in Dry Creek. She fell into a deep, troubled sleep. She was dreaming. She was in the barn, but it was the old barn. It was on fire. She was trying to get to the horses, but her feet were stuck in the mud, and then she was in the store, and Mr. Abernathy was throwing coins at her, but they were hot, burning her skin. She heard laughter, Silas's laughter, and her father's, and her sister's. Disgraced, they called. Worthless. She woke with a choked cry, sitting bolt upright in the bed, her heart hammering. The cabin was dark, the only light the red embers in the hearth. "Clara?" Luke's voice, thick with sleep. She was trembling, disoriented. "The fire, they were laughing." A large, warm hand found hers in the dark. "You are safe," he said. He sat up, his bare shoulders a solid shape against the darkness. He did not pull her close. He just held her hand. "I am here." She looked at him, at this quiet, solid man who had become the anchor of her entire world, the man who had been terrified he would burn everything he loved. She squeezed his hand, her breathing slowing. "You stayed," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a statement. He had not run, he had not broken, he had stayed. "I will always stay," he said. Years passed. The plain was dotted with small homesteads. The sapling trees they had planted around the cabin were now tall, offering shade. Clara's hair was threaded with silver, and Luke's face was a map of deep, kind lines. Their home was a sanctuary. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up. It was a small, poorly managed rig, pulled by a tired-looking horse. A young man, barely 20, helped a girl down. She was small, and she was crying. She wore a thin, cheap dress, and she clutched a small valise to her chest. Clara walked onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ma'am," the young man said, his voice cracking. This is my wife, Mary. We lost our wagon in the river. We lost everything. She is scared, and she is cold." Mary looked up at Clara, her eyes wide with terror, her face streaked with tears and dust. She was a child, sent into a world that was too big and too cruel. Clara looked at her, and she did not see a stranger. She saw herself. She saw the girl in the thin wool coat, standing in the mud, waiting for a man who was not coming. Luke had come out of the new barn, his face curious. Clara looked at him, a silent, shared memory passing between them. He nodded, his eyes soft, and went back inside. Clara walked down the steps. She went to the young, terrified bride. Mary flinched as she approached. "You are safe here," Clara said, her voice low and calm. "You are safe." She took the girl's small, cold hand. "Come inside. Let us get you warm." She led her into the cabin, into the warmth and the smell of baking bread. Luke had stoked the fire and placed a chair near it. He laid a heavy, knitted shawl over the back of the chair. It was one Clara had made, warm and soft. "Sit," Clara said. She took the shawl and wrapped it, slowly and gently, around the girl's shivering shoulders. She tucked it under her chin. Mary looked up at her, her sobs quieting. I I do not know. I do not know what to do. Clara knelt in front of her, taking the girl's hands in her own, calloused, warm ones. You do not have to do anything right now. Clara said, you just have to be warm. This is where you get to be seen. The girl looked at her, a flicker of understanding, of hope in her tear-filled eyes. That evening, long after the young couple was settled in the small guest room Luke had added to the cabin, Clara stood by the front window. She was watching the wind, as she so often did. It was sweeping over the tall, silver grass of the plain, moving it in waves, like a great, breathing ocean. It was beautiful. It was free. She heard Luke's footsteps behind her. He came and stood close, his chest pressing against her back. He said nothing. He just slipped his arms around her waist, his large, familiar hands covering hers. He kissed the back of her neck, a warm, quiet kiss that spoke of 20 years of shared mornings and long nights. She smiled, leaning her head back against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, leather and hay and wood smoke. She whispered to the glass, to the wind, to him, "Don't laugh. I was sent here as a joke." He held her tighter. His lips brushed her ear, his voice a low, warm rumble that she had built her life on. "And I," he replied, "got the last laugh." Thank you for listening, and please comment with where you are listening from so you can connect with one another. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.